This is Dr. Charles Parker, and you're listening to Corebrain Journal. It's a place where I connect both fresh discoveries and interesting different perspectives from advanced mind science with the realities of real people and everyday life down on Main Street. Well, welcome aboard one more time, folks. Dr. Charles Parker here, hosting Corebrain Journal. And we have yet another terribly interesting guest. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm lucky to be here, and you're lucky to be here with me listening to Dr. J. Lombard, an expert. He's a neurologist by training, but he is a deep maven on all kinds of interesting stuff. And tonight, some of the things we're going to be talking about is the genetics of psychiatry and what could be done to get things straight when people are treatment failures. Welcome aboard, Jay. We're so happy to have you on board.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Quick disclaimer. I know Jay from the past. We have been distant friends. It's just fun to renew our acquaintance, and we'll talk some more later on about what he told me walking in the woods after we had mutual presentations at a conference up in Massachusetts. Yeah. So the introduction real quickly will be in just a second. Let me say a few words from our sponsors before we begin. Corebrain Journal is supported by Direct Health Access Laboratory with over 3 million studies. They're deep leaders of experience with the big picture of measuring, just for example, methylation, cryptopyrrole, and copper challenges. They provide a global service with a molecular focus. See more laboratory details at dhalab.com/core, C-O-R-E. Corebrain Journal is also supported by the nonprofit Barry Robinson Center teams in Norfolk, Virginia, who provide residential care on an evolved family, interpersonal, and global level for children and adolescents who are treatment failures in different other parts of, treatment land, wherever it happens to be. And these folks are very, very interested in putting together packages that are more comprehensive, really in tune with what we're going to be talking about tonight. They're doing genetic testing. They're really above the standard of care of residential care. So take a look over at barryrobinson.org/core. That's BARRY Robinson.org/core. And they have lots of information about what we're doing over there. So let me introduce you folks to Dr. J. Lombard. Very interesting guy, an internationally acclaimed neurologist, an author and keynote speaker who creates solutions for brain health and intractable neurologic disorders. Who is not interested in that? Dr. Lombard integrates biological, psychological, and existential components in his holistic treatment approach. He's the co-founder and the creator of Genomind, a medicine company utilizing genetic testing to improve neuropsychiatric conditions, which I was talking about a moment ago, but get this, including Alzheimer's, autism, and depression. The founder of TED-Med, and we all know about TED Talks, TED-Med, Jay Walker, describes Dr. Lombard as, quote, part Freud, part Sherlock Holmes. Wouldn't we all like to be that? Deep compliment. Dr. Lombard's discoveries have been recorded as key opinion leaders as fundamentally shifting the paradigm of psychiatric medicine. That is what we're talking about tonight. The paradigm is shifting, and Dr. Lombard is going to help us with it. So he's the chief of neurology at both Westchester Square Medical Center and Bronx Lebanon Hospital. He was
previous. Not currently.
I didn't say was loud enough there. And
Got it.
He was a clinical assistant professor at New York Presbyterian Hospital and Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He's been published extensively in medical textbooks, peer-reviewed papers, medical journals as well. He has authored several popular nonfiction works related to the effects of nutrition on the brain, including The Brain Wellness Plan. His newest book, The Mind of God, I've heard good things about this, explores the relationship between neuroscience and faith, and is set for release June 13th, 2007. So it's probably out there already.
No, 6/13 actually, of 2017. No, it already came out.
Yeah, just checking.
The book is published.
It's one of those things, when you're an author, you're so involved with the doggone thing, and it's like, how do we get all this stuff to happen?
I'm working on my second proposal already. We can talk about that because I'm very excited about that as well. But
let's do talk about it. But he's also been an advisor to Academy Award-winning directors, Jonathan Demme and Martin Scorsese, who's not heard of Martin Scorsese, on Hollywood feature films. He's been on Larry King Live, Ted Med, CBS News, Food Network, and hung out with Dr. Oz. Yes. So right now, he's currently the Chief Scientific Officer at Genomind, as we were talking about the genetic testing, and is in private practice as the Clinical Director of Neuroscience at Lifespan Medicine, where he's well known for his compassion and dedication to his patients. Jay is a smart guy, and he is a sweetheart of a guy. He cares about what he's doing, no question about it. So, Jay, how did you get into the deeper chasing these details down that seem so obscure and so arcane and so, in a way, non-traditional? How did you start to make that change?
I think that, when we try to understand our own brain, because, we really are in many ways our brains, everything that we do, experience and remember is all because of our brain functionality. I think that there are two ways of exploring it. One is going as deep down into a reductionistic approach to look at the molecular aspects of behavior, to understand the physiology of the human connectome, how DNA expression is affected by experience. But I think the other aspect is really existential and understanding sort of the mind. And in many ways, I kind of half jokingly say that psychiatry has lost its mind, meaning that we've thrown away a lot of the most valuable insights of Freud and other predecessors in psychiatry for this purely reductionistic approach to medicine. And I think that we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater in the process.
So true. I mean, what is reductionistic? It's like everything's a med. Just throw the med at them and don't ask any questions. Find a label, a superficial label based on appearances, not involved with science, and just throw some meds at them. Talk to you later. Got to go. Hope that works. It's the standard of care is appearance medicine.
Yeah, and I think it's even worse than that because the average psychiatrist right now is seeing 20 to 25 patients a day for medical management. We're seeing all these atrocious acts being committed almost on a daily basis now, mass shootings and other episodes of just, completely irrational, violent behavior. And yet really the onus of understanding and identifying these conditions really should sit on behavioral health experts. And yet all they do essentially is throw out antipsychotic medications, which have more adverse effects than effects. And we are really in a deep existential hole as a society, which is kind of what motivates me to get up every day to work against that system that is so destructive to patients' well-being.
We're brothers from a different mother, Jay. I'll tell you that. No question about it. Because what happens is it's been our message here at Corebrain Journal since we started. And what happens is there are a lot of people who share your concern and are looking forward to it. So let's take it the next step. And that is when you made that turn into the deeper research and understanding of the genetics. How did all that take place?
So we could talk about sort of the molecular biology of neuropsychiatric diseases, and I'll try to distill it down into sort of the core essence of what we've discovered, which is that the majority of genes related to psychiatric diseases either produce a overexcitation of certain neurotransmitters in the brain, like glutamate, which produces an abnormal depolarization of brain cells, or conversely, there is an excessive hyperpolarization of neurons, particularly in areas of dopamine neurotransmission that are fundamental to our ability to experience pleasure. So if we understand sort of the a basic principle that Freud first talked about, the pain-pleasure principle, and we apply sort of that knowledge to our molecular understanding of the biology of these conditions, i.e. glutamate and dopamine, the data reveals itself. In other words, we found, for one major example, is that a single gene overlaps in very different and unique psychiatric disorders, which otherwise, as they have appearances, are very different. So that gene is called the calcium channel gene. It is regulating ion channels, which produce excitability in brain cells, and that there are variants of this gene that lead to abnormal or excessive depolarization of neurons in conditions as broadly and as different as schizophrenia, autism, major depression, PTSD, and even ADHD. And that tells us that there are these fundamental pathways that we can observe and understand so that we can actually treat the underlying molecular disturbances as opposed to taking a symptomatic drug that doesn't address the core abnormality. So really the value of genetics in psychiatry is more targeted therapy and targeted specifically not at symptoms, but underlying altered physiology.
And really what's happening with the neurotransmitters themselves as opposed to just collecting the chickens. You know, what happens, meds do collect the chickens to some degree in the chicken ranch of the brain, but which are neurotransmitters. But the issue is the basic chicken construct in the first place. And now let's talk about that polarization concept, because I know some of our listeners would like to understand that a little more. That's an inside term. And now clarify this on the polarization. Are you talking about that it keeps the activity, the neurophysiologic activity from taking place because they're depolarized, or is it making it happen excessively?
So think about, as by way of analogy for your listeners, that you're looking at New York City at night and you're seeing all the lights flickering in the various apartments across the city landscape. And those lights flickering on and off resemble neuronal activity of the brain. So the lights go on when we depolarize cells. That produces activation or excitation of various regions of the brain. And when the lights go off, we call that hyperpolarization or inhibition. And the brain, like the heart, is an oscillating organ, meaning that it's constantly changing its state from a state of excitation to a state of inhibition. And we actually measure this commonly in neurology through EEG, right? EEG just measuring the rate of depolarization of these cells. The problem with EEG, however, is you're only getting the surface electrodes. So the activity that you're monitoring is in psychiatry much deeper than just the cortex. We know that a lot of psychiatric diseases are what we call subcortical. Their origins are deeper than just the cortex, and that's why we can't really monitor them very effectively with the EEG.
So well said. I mean, and then we get into all the, the limbic systems, the basal ganglia, and then we get into the neurotransmitters, so there are brain regions that do certain things, and then we have specific neurotransmitter systems that also do certain things. So the issue is, I think it's so interesting because I've always been interested in the cytochrome P450 system. It was an easy thing to get into, which is really not the brain, but the liver. And because I came at it from a traditional psych point of view, and that is how come these meds aren't working? I'm giving the meds correctly based on this superficial diagnosis, but I'm shooting blanks. And I know what should be happening, but this person's telling me it's not happening. And somewhere in there is when I became interested in just the first pathway, way before it gets up to to the brain, which is the liver pathway and the cytochrome P450 system. So you guys do something with all of that.
So we at Genomind do two things. We check what you're describing, which is called pharmacokinetics, which is the behavior of a drug in a person's body based upon those enzymes that break down the drug, and degrade it for excretion. And the majority of psychiatric drugs are very much impacted by those cytochrome enzymes in a way that when we give a certain dose of a medication, you could see very variable responses based upon drug metabolism. The second sort of broad category of genetics in psychiatry, though, is much more interesting, both, I think, for psychopharmacologists, but even the general public. So it's worth explaining that these genes that are related to proteins in the brain that regulate neurotransmission. They actually regulate serotonin metabolism, glutamate metabolism, and dopamine metabolism as just three examples. But those are also impactful in both our understanding of how variants in those genes not only affect drug response, but also affect the phenotype of a psychiatric disease as well.
The way it looks. Phenotype, folks, is the way it looks on the outside. So it's
Right.
not only what's going on
Symptoms.
the inside,
Yep.
but it's sort of like what we actually see clinically in the office.
Correct.
So then what I'm just translating Jay a little bit, guys, because he's a deep neuroscience guy. But what we're saying here is there are many different internal situations that have to do with the way a body metabolizes the meds and uses meds. Or pardon me, I don't even know why I said that, because it's not meds alone. It's the way the body actually manages itself. It's more than just meds. The window into it is through the meds and recognizing they're not working the way they should. And then this raises all these other questions of what's going on with the neurophysiology, down to a synaptic, down to even transporter proteins in the presynaptic nerve. So you got all kinds of things going on there. And I remember very well that after a presentation, we gave a talk, obviously two different talks, but Jay and I were met at a meeting up in Massachusetts, and we were taking a walk in the woods on a path, just taking a break from all the activities. And Jay was telling me, and I'm going to have you tell it, Jay, because it was news to me about the nuances of some of the things that a person can see that's absolutely relevant to everyday psychiatric practice. Why don't we tell our listeners about that?
Sure. So it's a gene that's called the serotonin transporter gene that regulates the presence or absence of serotonin, a very important neurotransmitter that mediates homeostasis for the brain. And this gene actually regulates the ability of that neurotransmitter to go back into the presynaptic neuron. And what's been discovered is that particularly in Caucasians, less so in Asians, I know that you have a wide listenership in the East, so this is more applicable for Caucasians for whatever reason. But we know that those individuals who have inherited a defect in the serotonin transporter are more liable to experience symptoms of PTSD and treatment-resistant depression. And the reason for this is not exactly known, but there are some theories that have to do with the relationship of serotonin to a hormone called cortisol, the fight or flight hormone. But the importance of identifying the serotonin transporter defect genetically is mostly clinically relevant. And we know that there are a lot of factors, in addition to genetics, that can regulate the transporter protein, including low dose of lithium, as well as estrogen. And this may account for why we see cyclical dysfunction in mood disorders in women, particularly premenstrually, as a result of alterations in estrogen levels that then thereby affect serotonin levels in the brain.
So let's talk a little more even precisely about that. So I really appreciate you reminding me about that. And the issue is what Dr. Lombard is saying here, folks, is that these other communication systems that are going on in the body, for example, the endocrine system and the estrogen, can actually affect that transporter activity so that it would actually interfere with the transporter, which is the recycling of the neurotransmitter back into that presynaptic nerve. This is molecular physiology, my friends, and it's available right here with commonplace testing. I mean, it's not commonplace because not everybody can really read it, but I mean, I know Genomind does such a good job of reporting it that you don't really have to be a rocket science person to understand the application. The results are there on paper of why this medication is not working. So what Jay told me when we were walking along, he said, "Hey, Parker, this this low dose lithium can actually affect that serotonin transporter. I remember that very well. Let's talk a little bit about that, if you will, Jay.
Sure. I think that, this idea of low-dose lithium has really gone mainstream in the last years. And it's certainly, I think, very positive development in traditional neuroscience, because when we talked about this, it must have been, maybe eight years ago, I'm guessing, that observation was made clinically. But the reality is that low-dose lithium, people are afraid of lithium because they traditionally associate with, manic depression and all sorts of side effects. But low-dose lithium are doses that are well below the doses that are used for an acute psychiatric disorder like mania. We're talking about, 20 milligrams or less. And what lithium does in the brain is vitally important to understand. It increases a neurotrophic factor that helps promote the growth of neurons. It's a protein called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So lithium is one of the key elements of increasing the amount of BDNF. And BDNF has been associated with what's called resilience. When we get hit in the head, or we have trauma, emotional or physical trauma, the brain relies on the production of BDNF to actually promote neurogenesis, to promote new brain growth. And lithium is one of the cofactors that supports BDNF production to enhance resilience. So clinically, the data has been shown, and there's lots of data on this, that low-dose lithium may prevent the progression of dementia in certain subsets of patients. Low-dose lithium also may actually have a beneficial effect in other conditions besides dementia. And I think that people are beginning to pay a lot more attention to it. But one of its mechanisms, as we described walking through the woods that day, and a snowy day up in Kripalu, was that an unidentified marker of lithium's potential benefit may be for people who have that abnormality in the serotonin transporter. And by taking low-dose lithium, we are actually potentially switching that abnormality to a functional transporter protein. I think that's what we talked about back in the day.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I was like, it's fun when a light bulb goes on. It's many years ago, and you and I haven't talked for many years, really. And we're talking here. It's like, bingo. I still remember that very well because I really appreciate it. It's like, oh my gosh, that is such an interesting point, because I've been into the whole genetic testing concept. I really hadn't gotten into it until, shortly after that, when I realized this was immediately available. When I got interested in genetic testing originally, it was, I think the outfit was Genelex, and I think they were in Seattle, and it cost like $1,000 to get a test, and nobody could afford $1,000 because you couldn't sell it because no one even knew what it was. Even if you knew what it was, no one else knew what it was, so there was no sense in even talking about it. But with the advances, like what Dr. Lombard's talking about here, this is everyday practice with a lot of individuals, and knowing about that serotonin transporter makes a significant difference in people's lives. It's amazing.
It also, the other benefit of lithium, if I can come back to that, it's the only compound in the psychiatric armamentarium to date which has been shown that it reduces suicidal ideation, so that a lot of people with depression have suicidal ideation. And, obviously people need to know that lithium can be used as an augmentation strategy alongside traditional antidepressants for that purpose. And it's never been, fully unequivocally described as being an agent that may reduce suicidal ideation, but it's such a non-toxic compound in low doses. In fact, there's also studies that have shown that in areas where lithium is depleted in the soil, there's higher likelihood of aggressive behavior, including homicides and suicides, compared to populations that have higher lithium in the soil. And even 7-Up was initially marketed with lithium to compete with Coca-Cola, which had cocaine in it. So it's historically, there's a lot of interest in the whole lithium story.
That's why 7 was up, huh?
That's why 7 was up. But really, well, who knows? I wasn't back then to know.
I just think it's interesting. Now, listeners, let's pay attention to this point. Now, what Dr. Lombard's talking about, this isn't something to go in and ask your psychiatrist to get 300 milligrams of lithium for, and take it at bedtime. This is not what he's talking about. Remember the dose that he was talking about is a low dose of 20 milligrams, and
or
less, even 15. You tell me. I mean, I'm not accustomed.
There's still debate around that. So there's even studies that show microdosing of lithium at 1 milligram or less may be sufficient as a maintenance dose for the average person. So just obviously people need who need lithium for one purpose. We're not talking about for treatment. We're talking about its effects as an essential nutrient, just as we think of zinc and magnesium as an essential nutrient.
And winds up being an augmentation strategy. Now, we're going to take a quick break here, Jay, and I'm going to come back and ask you this question because you got us stimulated on depression. It's an easy one to see the need for. I mean, and really starting to understand the neurophysiology of the transporter proteins is a big deal. It's way beyond cytochrome P450, which you guys do a good job with on the front end. But the next question I want to ask you after we take this break is, what are the implications? How does this all work with some of these more, what would be considered by many, untreatable conditions like Alzheimer's, autism, some of those things that we briefly touched upon when we started? Let's take a moment to talk more about those when we return. Let's take a break now. Well, folks, you know as well as I do that psychiatric treatment failure, especially after multiple medication trials and those very, very brief hospitalizations, may prove insufficient to deal at home with the complexity of troubled children and those adolescents from 6 to 17 years old. Improved care, those next mandatory steps, should include a more comprehensive approach to address those multiple levels of challenges, from family to peers to school, diagnostically from defiance to depression, on every level for families, including military families internationally. The Barry Robinson Center's 32-acre open college-like campus in Norfolk, Virginia, provides safety and security and clean, comfortable living. How do we know? We refer folks over there all the time, strongly endorse what they're doing. So for further information, an informed interview, connect at this page, barryrobinson.org/core. Well, you folks already know that here at Corebrain Journal, we're on a mission to introduce you to resources that make significant contributions to the investigation of those predictable mind science applications. Our colleagues at DHA Lab Group provide a real difference with treatment options for people at every level, from first awareness of mind problems to those frustrating times when even well-informed treatment becomes surprisingly unpredictable. For my entire professional life, from psychoanalysis to brain scans, I've searched for, yes, improved predictability. The good news for all of us, from professionals to patients, remarkably effective research offers useful, cost-effective, organic options far beyond guesswork with psychiatric medications alone. DHA lab tests measure unbalanced biomedical details through easily available testing, now available globally for a variety of molecular answers from, for example, methylation, copper, and cryptopyrrole challenges. Check in for more details at dhalab.com core. That's dhalab.com/core. Well, Jay, once again, I want to thank you for coming on board. It's so nice and so pleasant to renew our acquaintance. And I can't tell you how much I admire your work and the work of individuals like Genomind doing these really remarkable things. And they're available in every doctor's offices. That any doctor that's interested in it can get some training and figure out how to do this and actually increase the possibility, diminish the possibility of treatment failure. And that's a big deal. So tell us about the Alzheimer, autism, and see, I don't know enough about to ask the question correctly. Are they related in some way, or is there a way you can break them out in a way we can understand that in terms of understanding those genetic maladaptions?
Yep. So let's talk about the clinical biology of depression, right? And I think that we can understand it in ways that are not very complicated at all. So dopamine is one of the primary neurotransmitters. We think of serotonin as being a principal neurotransmitter, but it's not. Dopamine is the primary neurotransmitter that is involved in hedonism, our ability to experience pleasure when we have an experience. And we know that dopamine metabolism is also affected genetically. So I think that, a lot of people are in this sort of, I think, mistaken mythology that we can simplify neurotransmitters and describe, serotonin levels as being low or high. And, it's just the wrong way to think about these things. So, I mean, any sort of questions you have about that, I'd be glad to answer. But I think that we're at risk of oversimplifying these very complicated disorders by trying to just, hook a single neurotransmitter onto them. This is why I think the data on calcium channels specifically is relevant. Okay, so it's a conversation. I'm not sure how deep we should go into it on this because obviously it's a complicated topic. But I can answer any specific questions.
I would just run out of Jay. I'll tell you why. Because one of the reasons we're doing this is not only you're going to train me right now because you're on the edge of what I know, so I'm looking forward to it. But the other issue is, I think if we just enlarge the conversation, get the vocabulary down and get the concepts down, we're not going to go out and become, board certified with this, and we're not going to run out and tell our doctors what to do necessarily. But I think if we get the concept, then we want to understand why testing like Genomind testing is applicable and usable in everyday practice. So what about those calcium channels? What's going on with them?
So they're gating mechanisms, meaning that they are responsible for the excitation or the inhibition of the brain itself. So when we have these ion channels affected by genes, it affects the balance or the homeostasis of the excitation and the inhibition of the brain.
It actually changes the function of the neurotransmitters.
It changes the particularly glutamate. So there's a direct relationship of calcium channels to the neurotransmitter glutamate.
So then the next question then, so we've jumped from serotonin where we started with depression. You hit a little bit on dopamine. Let's dive a little more into glutamate and its relevance for some of these other clinical conditions.
Yep. Okay. So we can talk about, any condition particularly because I think that what's been happening in psychiatry and where we see sort of a ground swelling of change is that we previously are describing these conditions based on something called DSM, which is, like you said earlier, just an appearance, just the symptoms, it's just a describing of a psychiatric disorder without really any kind of insight into the underlying physiology. And what genetics allows us to do is to probe deeper into the physiology of these network systems. So what we're seeing in our genetic discoveries is that conditions that are as diverse as bipolar, which a person can have, high mood lability, or a person with dementia who is just essentially, progressing with neurodegenerative changes in the brain, or an autistic child that looks very different, obviously, than either of those two conditions, can be understood to have overlapping pathophysiological changes related to those balance of excitation and inhibition in the brain.
Very interesting. And so one would imagine that these conditions, if they're not being stimulated correctly, could go to a low-grade chronic deterioration.
Yep, exactly.
And so inflammation, can inflammation change that over time? There's a lot of talk about inflammation as it relates to Alzheimer's, and there's a lot of talk in toxins as it relates to autism. So do these maladaptive challenges, do they actually change neurologic function?
Yep, exactly. That's right. And, I think that with the understanding of inflammation to psychiatry is something that, 10 years ago, people really, sort of looked away at. And I think now we're starting to realize that that is just, a completely, the dismissal of the relationship was such an oversight by neuroscientists, because there is no question, it's unequivocal, that for the majority of psychiatric diseases, as well as many, many neurological conditions, that inflammation and degeneration of the brain are two, bandits in the same foxhole, if you will, or whatever the analogy you want to use. And we need to understand that physiology as well. I mean, it's related to a prostaglandin called arachidonic acid, which is, a byproduct of lipid metabolism. So when certain lipids break down, they form arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid acts as an excitatory neurotransmitter. It actually prevents the reuptake of glutamate, so that glutamate becomes more of a depolarizing, excitotoxic neurotransmitter. And, we now know that anti-inflammatory agents in certain cases have antidepressant effects.
So that glutamate actually accumulates. And when it accumulates, the more neurotransmission activities are diminished.
Yep, exactly.
So, and go ahead. Sorry, please.
No, that's it. Yeah, I think that what we're seeing is novel antidepressant responses to things that we classically would not have thought had antidepressant effects. For instance, we now know that omega-3 fatty acids in certain patients have antidepressant effects. We know that, in some patients, vitamin D levels are low, and that vitamin D has antidepressant effects because it's an anti-inflammatory, hormone. So there's lots of examples of non-pharmaceutical agents that can help benefit the brain that are related to the anti-inflammatory effect. They lower IL-6, for instance, or they lower C-reactive protein levels that are abnormal in these conditions. And, we can just go on and talk about these discoveries, because they really lend themselves to a whole larger amount of interventions beyond just traditional psychopharmacology.
Now, apropos of that point, I think one of the things that I think we're in a transition in psychopharmacology and in all of mind science. One of the things I like to talk about, Jay, is this. I think we're in a Galileo mind moment, and we're really haven't looked through the telescopes. We think telescopes are snake oil, and yet when you actually get out of your belief system that the sun is rotating around Rome, and you get into the telescope and you look at what's actually going on, the universe changes dramatically. And I think individuals like yourself are thought leaders in terms of really going into the telescopic vision that's really available to people on the street in Tallahassee. I mean, this is the kind of things that Genomind does, and the things that you are talking about here. They're a little deep for the average person, but, calcium channels, glutamate activity, and significantly deteriorated brain function are one thing, but we see people that are bothered on an everyday basis, commonplace individuals that are treatment failure using traditional, straight up, here's the diagnosis, take this medication treatment. The limitations are pervasive, and that's one of the reasons there's such a stigma with psychiatry, and you know this even better than I do, because we see it happen all the time. They hate to come in and see a psychiatrist, and they certainly don't want to tell somebody they're seeing a psychiatrist. Why? Because there's a commonplace belief, pardon me for getting on my soapbox a little bit, but that the whole thing is limited, and somebody is going to do what we're talking about here. Here's the diagnosis, we'll throw some meds at you. And I think one of the things and why I'm so happy to have you on is because with a little more understanding, precision occurs. You can see the universe for what it is. It's pretty darn interesting.
Yep, absolutely.
So tell us a little more. We started getting off there on the calcium channels and glutamate. Now, glutamate, or the glutamate activity, is modified by calcium channels. So if the calcium channels are closed, you have an increase of glutamate. If they're open, you have a decrease.
No, just the opposite. No,
goes the other way.
glutamate
Okay.
actually, yeah, so glutamate binds to subreceptors in the brain. They're called NMDA receptors, but there are other glutamate receptors as well. But when glutamate binds to its postsynaptic receptor, it produces a conformational change in the receptor so that the ion channel goes open. And when the ion channel opens up, two ions flow into the cell, sodium and or calcium. And by the way, it's very interesting. I just remembered now, like 20 years ago, I had one patient with epilepsy that before any of this discoveries of ion channels even was known, who his wife told me whenever he eats a lot of salt, he has a seizure. I'm like, oh, that's just totally nonsense. And now that we know that, changes in sodium and calcium alter the ion flux and actually produce, these changes in not only cell activity, but in the behavior of a person themselves. So there's a direct connection between the abnormality of these ion channels and behavior. And that's what's so fascinating, that we actually can trace the molecular effects of these ion channels. And when a person or a patient has a defect in these channels, they're more likely to express certain symptoms like irritability or mood lability with a higher propensity of having these alterations that would not normally be as likely to be seen in a person that doesn't have those abnormalities.
And in fact, they wouldn't. And in fact, if they took medications for them, the medications wouldn't work predictably. There's an unpredictable response to medications, which are only addressing a very small part of this other complex picture going on.
Well, the interesting thing is I think that, a lot of drug discovery in psychiatry and neurology is anecdotal. We think that we're so smart and we could actually, conform to a specific neurotransmitter and then develop a drug that blocks a certain receptor. But really, it's the other way around. We found that these drugs worked for these conditions, and then understood the mechanisms of why they work. So all the anticonvulsant drugs, for instance, that are used not only for epilepsy but also for bipolar, and in fact, there's a lot of comorbidity between bipolar and epilepsy, that it all traces back to these ion channels, high glutamate, and excessive depolarization. And the significance of this for the average listener or even for the doctor is that when you're using a medication like lithium or an anti-seizure medication, we're using even hormonal therapy like progesterone, which is in sort of an endogenous calcium channel blocker in the brain. It's nice to know that what you're doing is that you're providing that patient with an ability to normalize an otherwise abnormal physiological system.
Jay, we have to wind up, unfortunately, but I'm telling you, you have dropped so many interesting information bombs right here on everybody that's listening. I mean, when you think about where we started the conversation, we're talking about a walk in the woods. Then we went into cytochrome P450. We hit depression. We hit calcium channel blockers. We're talking about sodium and calcium, and we're talking about bipolar illness. And really, I like that little side trip we took down BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, and resilience and lithium. I mean, we've covered a lot of material in a short period of time. What's going to happen, listeners, you're just going to have to listen to it again. I'm going to tell you, listeners, I'm going to have a lot of links in the show notes on this episode, because this is not something you're going to get in a half hour, 45 minutes. It is complicated, but there is a wide embrace. Dr. Leonard is showing us how we can wrap our arms around this entire situation with just some good, accurate testing. It changes the predictability model enormously because we actually know what we're doing instead of shooting at windmills. It's just, that's the way it is. So Jay, I want to thank you very much. In closing, tell us how we can get a hold of you. What would be the best way to contact you?
Best way is just through my website, drjlombard.com. Anyone could follow the links and see what different things I'm involved with writing books and, doing research and seeing patients is all part of my love of the brain and trying to help people in any way I can. So thank you for the time to discuss some of the research that I'm involved with. But, the mind of God is a different work altogether. It's more about sort of existentialism and belief systems and how that affects our biology. But that's a whole different discussion, Charlie.
We need to come back for that because it's another interest I have, to tell you the truth. And we could just talk about the mind of God. I'd have to read it, then we could have a discussion. But I would welcome you coming back to talk about it, Jay. It'd be a lot of fun.
Thank you very much for having me, Charlie. Good night.
Thank you, buddy. You have a good one. Thanks for listening to Corebrain Journal. We're working every day behind the scenes to bring you reports that connect research benches with those street trenches. Here we share the complexity of mind science because, as you know, details really do matter. One of the most pervasive, misunderstood challenges is how commonplace medications, like those written for ADHD, are used so regularly without clear guidelines. If you think you'd like more specifics, take a minute to download my 2-page PDF packed with video links and references on the absolute essentials of how to start ADHD medications. They're easily available at corebrainjournal.com/start. Thanks for listening. Do connect and stay tuned. Together we can make a difference.